Dreaming of enlarging the activities of his empire, it seemed to him that money itself was no more than the means to the end he desired. The shrewd brain of his minister of finance, the Persian who had been raised to office by the favor of Khatun, devised a scheme to satisfy the Khakan, and the Chinese advisers, wiser than the Persian Ahmed, made no objection. So long as taxes were kept down, they did not care what the Yuan dynasty might do with the finances. Certainly they could visualize the end of it better than Kubilai. Ahmed's plan was to issue banknotes payable in silver to the amount of only half their face value. The unit of Chinese currency was the ounce of silver. These printed notes were known as Pao Chao, precious paper. The price of this new paper currency was fixed by law. The banknotes had to be accepted at face value. So while the government took its tax toll largely in silk, crops, furs, and animals, it paid its expenses with paper. Marco Polo, coming in contact with such financing for the first time, was in ecstasies over the magical ease with which it functioned. I shall tell you, he relates almost with emotion, of the mint which the emperor hath in his city. Tell it how I may, you never will be convinced that it is actually true. The emperor's mint is so wrought that you would say he hath found the philosopher's stone, and you would be right, for he makes his money after this fashion. From the bark of a tree, the mulberry tree, the leaves of which feed the silkworms, the fine inner skin is taken. This is made into something like sheets of paper. These sheets, which are black, are cut up into different sizes, the largest being worth 10 Venetian bezants, about 10 liang, are ounces of silver. All these pieces of paper are printed with as much care as if they were actually pure gold or silver. On every piece, officials write their names. Then the chief officer of the Khan puts red vermilion on the state seal and stamps it upon this paper. The money is then authorized, and anyone forging it may be put to death. And Khan causes such a vast amount of this paper money, which cost him nothing to be made every year, that it must equal the other treasures of the world. These pieces of paper he makes pass wherever his sovereignty extends, in all territories, and with them he makes all payments on his own account. Nobody, however great in rank, dares refuse them, and indeed the people take them readily, because with them sales and purchases of goods can be transacted as well as with coins of gold or silver. More than that, merchants arriving from India or foreign lands, bringing with them gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, are forbidden to sell to anyone but the emperor's treasurer. He has 12 expert appraisers to buy in this way at liberal prices. With these pieces of paper, the merchants accept his price willingly, because they would not get so good a figure elsewhere, and they get it quickly. It is true that these merchants bring in valuables to the amount of 400,000 bezants several times in a year, so that the Khan buys up such a quantity that his treasure grows beyond count, while the paper money he pays out costs him nothing. And more at times throughout the year, public proclamation is made that anyone having gold or silver or gems or pearls may take them to the mint and get a handsome price. The owners are glad to do this, because they can find no one else to give so good a price, though those who choose may let it go unheeded in time. In this way, most of the valuables of the empire come into the treasury of the Khan. And if any baron hath need of gold or such in order to make plate or ornaments or the like, he goes in turn to the mint and buys what he wishes, paying in this paper money. When any of the pieces of paper are spoiled, and they are not as flimsy by any means, the owner carries them to the mint, and by paying 3% charges, he gets new paper money for the old. What Messer Marco does not mention is that the precious paper could only purchase bullion to half its nominal amount. Without doubt, Kubilai paid no attention to the workings of his financial scheme, or rather Ahmed's, so long as things could be bought with the notes. But the amount of the precious metal outside the treasury grew less each year, while the government's expenditures kept on scaling up with the cost of new wars. The issuing of 1269 of the Bulgar era was 228,960 ounces of silver, and silver had a purchasing power in Asia at that time, many times its value today. While in 1290 of the Common Era, it rose to the amazing figure of 50,002,500 ounces. So, while the treasure of the Khan grew to vast proportions, the country as a whole was flooded with increasing amounts of paper. Not any law of the Minister of Finance or the death penalty could maintain the value of paper, which was issued each year in increasing amounts. Sellers inevitably asked more paper for goods. Kubilai's ministers had no trouble in finding a solution of this difficulty. The paper currency was devalued. The new price was set at one-fifth the old, and financing went on as before. The consequence of this inflation was not felt for a generation, not until after the death of the persuasive Kubilai, and he lived to a full old age. In his 80 years he was destined to see the final conquest, the grandeur, and the beginning of the disintegration of the empire of the Golden family. Messer Marco's narrative of these years echoes a curious excitement. We feel that the man is exaggerating, and at times this is true, but in the main he is giving us a life portrait of Kubilai against the background of China. We may think it strange that he does not mention what appears to us today to be notable: the Great Wall, the drinking of tea, the bound feet of the secluded women. But the merchant of Venice has an appraiser's soul, and he's intoxicated with statistics of trade and ever-swelling profits. He thinks in terms of foreign exchange in this utopia of commerce. He mentions only casually the ghosts of the Gobi. He is much more concerned with the numbers of remounts kept by the great Khakan at the post stations along the desert routes. In fact, Kubilai is the real adventurer, and Messer Marco, his man of business. Marco dismisses the other Mongols as gentlemen of leisure, although he is a little envious of their life of luxury and faculties for sport. They are brave men and hardened to war. They live like gentlemen, troubling themselves about nothing but hunting and looking after their falcons, unless it be war. They have more children than other men because they have more wives. Without being aware of it, Marco has drawn a portrait of the aristocrats of the steppes who have moved into an environment of civilization. Work is intolerable to their pride, and they occupy themselves with leisure, sport, and women. But the Venetian speaks reverently of the prosperous trade of Cathay, of cities in which the suburbs of a dozen gates are each one larger than the whole of Venice, of rivers which 200,000 cargo boats ascend and leave each year, more than the merchant fleets of all the European West, of the ships themselves with 4 masts and a crew of 300 men laden with tons of coveted pepper and spice, of the black stones that are burned within houses for fuel, coal, and the black moisture in the earth that gives birth to flame, petroleum, and the miraculous tissue, asbestos, that is cleaned and not consumed by flame. Well, that one's not a good idea. Of Ling Nagan, he says, they have there so many merchants and such great riches, yielding a trade so important that no one can value it. Know for truth that the masters of the trades, who are the promoters, and their women never lay their hands to labor, but they lead a life so rich and splendid that you could call them kings. At Zaitan, Chow, he marvels over the varieties of silk loaded along the docks. Raw silk, silk of damask, camelicons, and brocades of gold, samites, and the heavy silks of luxury satins. 1,000 carts of these silk enter the city of the Khan. Each day he calculates on their way to the fishing factories, and I tell you that for one ship laden with spice that voyages from India to Alexandria, or a port of the Christian world, 100 set out for Zaitan. He swears, knowing that few people would believe him, that the ships of the great Khan import from Java spices still unknown in Europe, black pepper, white walnuts, Java, cubebs, and cloves, and the merchant fleets coming from Ceylon bring cargoes of ginger, cotton, and muslins of Hindu manufacture, as well as the pearls of the ocean and the diamonds of the Deccan. A few of these are penetrating to the markets of Alexandria and Venice, or setting up new standards of luxury in the West. Ironically, when this ardent economist returned at last to the polo establishment In Venice, his story was disbelieved until he displayed the jewels stored in his traveling coat. And Marco's words bear testimony to a new and vital change. The intermittent civil wars of the royal family interfered with the transcontinental land routes. It was becoming easier to go by sea, coasting down to the Bahang and across to Ceylon and up to the Persian Gulf, or to Egypt. Interocean traffic, which had been carried on only by a scattering of adventurous Arabs, was now in its birth throes, and it was moving from the civilized East toward the still so-called barbaric West. The word almost like excuses people, right? But frontier, but that's not quite it there, because they're not talking about frontiers. But among the Chinese inventions that found their way westward by slow stages were two that the Mongols employed without making much of them. But these two innovations had a vital effect upon the future of the West: gunpowder and the printing press. Powder had been known to the Chinese for some time, both its fusive and explosive qualities. They made use of it as a military weapon in a left-handed way, setting off makeshift bombs that terrified by flame and smoke. These bombs, lowered over the wall of Akin city in 1233, started the Mongol besiegers, and it is certain that Subutai and other commanders studied the strange firecasters for their own ends. In the European campaign of 1238 to 1241 of the Common Era, the Mongols used these flaming bombs in their attack on the Hungarian camp at the Battle of the Sayo, and their armies of occupation made use of the searing flame from powder with its resulting smokescreen. Moreover, the Franciscan friar Carpini, who visited Kuyuk's court, mentions a flamethrower used in a Mongol attack. Now it cannot be coincidence that the Franciscan Berthold Schwartz is supposed to have invented gunpowder in the portion of Eastern Europe in the years when these same Mongol armies were posted there. The other inventor of tradition, Friar Roger Bacon, is known by his own words to have talked with Friar William Rubruck, who visited the court of Mangu a dozen years after the Mongols had made acquaintance with gunpowder. Both Carpini and Rubruck were keen observers of the military inventions of the Mongols. Roger Bacon may have hit upon the formula of explosive powder before his meeting with Rubruck, but the fact remains that the Mongols were making active use of gunpowder at the same time. They did not, however, invent any workable cannon. In the campaigns of Kubilai, the siege engines used were the mechanical type, casting stones that remained for the Europeans to make the first destructive firearms and to develop artillery in which gunpowder could annihilate human beings in numbers and destroy cities. At the same time, a gentler art was making its way westward. The Franciscans who flocked toward China after Messer Marco's journey ended became acquainted with the delicate painting of the Sung and Yuan dynasties, and the memory of these paintings with their movement and their realism seems to have accompanied the friars homeward, because the first traces of this more human delineation appears within the walls of Assisi, the headquarters of the Franciscan order early in the 14th century. Long before then, the Chinese had printed their classic texts with wood blocks. In Kubilai's day, an edition of the Buddhist sacred texts was published, as well as the laws of his ministers and the banknotes that so intrigued Messer Marco. Not long after that, the Chinese experimented with movable types of metal. The knowledge of printing certainly reached the courts of the Ilkhans. Here a fine paper was made in Samarkand of silk floss.